Okay, welcome everybody. My name's David Trotter, and I'm a research portfolio manager at MRIWA. And today's webinar will be on Western Australia's green steel opportunity. The question is it possible? Is it possible, rather how to make it possible. So we'll be doing a PowerPoint presentation, and we have two presenters today. Myself, my name's David Trotter, and I've worked in the iron ore industry for about 35 years. And during that time, I've worked from mining right through to the steel side. I've worked in steel plants, but also worked in the iron ore and iron ore development. Currently, I'm at MRIWA, helping with government policy and helping funding research in iron ore and critical minerals and the processing of those minerals. And so thanks for joining this webinar. We've set this webinar up based on the reports that are published on the MRIWA website. So hopefully you've already had a glance at those. But this is meant to go through some of the key facts from that report. I'll go to introduce my colleague, if I can. And joining me today is Kenneth Leong from GHD. Ken's an economist with over 20 years experience in public, private and academic sectors. At GHD assists clients in economic and market analysis in renewable energy, resources and transport. Ken's area specialty is economic impact analysis, including the estimation of job creation and contribution to state and local economies, particularly from large-scale industrial projects. He completed a PhD in economics at the UWA and previously lectured at the West Australian School of Mines. So Ken was part of the team that assisted MRIWA in the Green Steel Opportunity Report, and GHD designed and implemented the model which we used to generate the outputs for that report, based on WA database, which was done through consultation with industry and stakeholders. So I welcome Ken to do the first part of the presentation, where he'll outline the model, and after he outlines the model and how what's the objectives of the green steel model, I'll run through some of the results. So Ken will take about 30 minutes, so bear with us. And the study aims to increase awareness and knowledge of the iron to steel making value chain, iron ore and steel making dynamics, emission profile, capital and infrastructure requirements, and opportunities of the risk of action and inaction. So the study of approach will be the topic of Ken's presentation, will be the development of the value chain model for steel production and estimates the cost, technology and emissions for each step. And the model runs scenarios replacing fossil fuel flow sheets with green alternatives. And then there'll be some discussion on those pathways and how they evolved. So I'd like to hand over to Ken. We'll leave the questions to the end. If you have any questions along the way, please put them into the chat function. And we've allocated about 30 minutes at the end of our presentation to address those. If you want to hang around for some of those question and answers, we'll also open the mic if we have time at the end as well. So thanks very much, Ken.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. We're dialing in from the home of the Wajak Noongar people, and we acknowledge the contributions they have made to country and culture, and I acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. GHD and our partner ASO Allen, we worked on this study with MRIWA, and this was recently published. The scope of our work is shown on the left panel. There were 4 items to study. The first of which is scenarios. What are realistic, possible, and perhaps aspirational scenarios for WA? The scenarios are grounded on modeling and analysis. Now, with regional attributes, we focus on the Midwest and Pilbara, although the study can be extended to other regions as well, with the understanding that all types differ. The mine to port distances may differ, renewable energy transmission may differ, and perhaps appetite for investment may also differ between these two regions. The third study task, market dynamics. This is where we review what the rest of the world is doing with green steel and technologies, and to track the various pilot projects that are going on. Here, we also look at the main steelmaking countries and how the advent of green steelmaking might affect them. Finally, with policy framework, we analyze and ask the question, what can the government do to incentivize investment in green steelmaking? Do existing legislation needs to change or be amended? And what role could the government play in green steelmaking research and development and to the development of setting up of CRCs? So MRIWA and us, we consulted as widely as we could throughout this study, and that culminated in us building a value chain model whereby we used it as a consistent framework to test several scenarios. We needed to build in as much granularity as we can in the steelmaking process in our model, as much as practical anyway. If we don't do that, we will not be able to estimate production costs, current field usage, potential decarbonisation opportunities, and looking at the emissions reductions within those steps. So we included the steps that you see in this diagram, all the way up to crude steel making. The reason for us not including finished steel products is that finished steel products are wide and varied, and they were not a focus of this study. Now, with this value chain that you can see, moving from left to right essentially increases the value of the saleable product. And we can think of this as comprising of four markets: mining, iron making, steel making, and transport. The current WA value chain ends at the red line that you see in the screen with DSO and magnetite concentrate exports. In fact, one could say that there's relatively little to no value adding done in WA. For our study, we found it useful to use a broader definition of green steel. To begin with a general or broad definition, green steel is a process whereby steel is produced using renewable energy, that is, with an elimination or reduced use of fossil fuels, such as coal, diesel, oil, and natural gas. Now, having a broader definition allows us to explore as many opportunities as we can for Western Australia, and our broader definition includes green activities in the entire mining to steelmaking value chain. This schematic here shows how fossil fuel intensive the whole steelmaking process is. These icons that you see there are power, electricity typically generated by gas-fired plants, diesel, and in the case of shipping, bunker fuel. Coking coal is used in iron making, and natural gas is also used throughout the process. Mining, of which we're focused on initially in Western Australia, is very much dependent on diesel. You can think of the transportation of ore from the mine to the port, through distances of about 350 kilometers, and that uses diesel. Now, when it comes to iron making, blast furnaces is very much dependent on coking coal, and many parts of the value chain is dependent on electricity, which is traditionally supplied by, I mentioned, gas-fired plants. Now, with freight, there are long distances in the transport of iron ore from places like Ponta de Madeira in Brazil or Dampier, and they use bunker fuel. Now, this chart will be repeated in Dave's part of the presentation a little bit later, but I thought it would be useful to mention that the steel industry produces about 7% of global emissions. Here in this waterfall chart, it shows the emissions that comes from the entire steelmaking process. An estimate of the blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace steelmaking emissions intensity is 2.1 tons per ton of steel made. Now, by far, the largest share of emissions comes from the integrated steelmaking part. And within this, the lion's share comes from the use of coking coal in iron making. Now, this diagram also shows how much or how little WA can move the global needle if we only decarbonize mining. Now, the question is, can we make a difference by moving to the right and using our vast renewable generation capabilities and investment capital to help the world decarbonize? This diagram here shows what a fully green steel process would look like today. It replaces diesel, oil, CCGT power, coal, and bunker fuel with electrification, battery electric locos, green hydrogen, and green ammonia. Now, do note though that some of the TRL, technology readiness level, is mature, but others are still at the pilot stage, whilst others are in R&D and in the stage of research and publications in scientific journals. So if we are able to do this, this is what the green steel process will look like. To allow us to test scenarios for Western Australia and what is feasible and what are aspirational, we wanted to base it around a model. And for that, we put together a value chain model. This slide here shows the inputs and outputs of the model. And over here, we can see that the first row there are the inputs to the modeling, where we look at the different steps of the steelmaking project. We saw in the diagram earlier from ore body to drilling and blasting to iron making to steel making. And for that, we also look at what's required in terms of capital for each of these steps. With consumable inputs, we're looking at things like fuel and water in the case of desalinated water required for hydrogen making, and also feedstock like lime and coal. In terms of geography, we focus on the Midwest and the Pilbara regions of the state, simply because the ore types differ and distances to port differ, and also current investment projects differ. Now, we also focus on renewable power, energy, and that's an input to the model. And finally, the model has a capability to do some scaling depending on how big or small a mine that we're looking at, or whether we choose to produce mining only, or steel or iron. Now, when it comes to the outputs of the model, we report the levelized cost of a project. And the levelized cost is essentially, if you think about, is the net present value of the stream of capital and operational costs over the duration of a project, discounted back to today and expressed as a unit. It's measured in typically dollars per ton or dollars per megawatt in the case of energy. We looked at the quantities required, the emissions profile, and also capital and land requirements. This panel of three little diagrams is an example of the user-entered settings for the model. In the left panel, we initially define the scenario whereby we essentially specify whether we are looking at hematite or magnetite, for example, and the split between fines and lump. And we also look at the level of emissions and things like also how many tons, the sizing of the mine facility, and also distances traveled. For example, distances between mine and port, and from port to final destination. And then that input set goes through the model engine, whereby combined with things like energy cost and a satellite model for renewables, we get the outputs. And it is the outputs that allow us to do our scenario analysis, whereby we can, at each step of the value chain, we can turn off fossil fuel and turn on green powered fuels, and then we can look at the the cost it would take to make that transition and the emissions saved. The model uses estimates of unit costs for power generation. It also factors in some chemistry, and of course, it includes the steps in the value chain we saw earlier. This here is just a screenshot of aspects of the model whereby it scales to whatever output we're looking at, and it will determine, just as an example with transport, how many haul trucks will be required to move that volume of iron ore, and how much fuel it would take. And likewise with shipping, how many ships and the turnaround time it would take, and the bunker fuel required to ship the product over to the destination. So that's a little bit about the setup of the model. We can get into it in more detail perhaps a little bit later, but I hope that gives everyone a little bit of a sense as to what the model is capable of and how we could use it to analyze the scenarios. Thank you.
Yes, no, thanks very much, Ken. That was a good overview of the model, and I just wanted to add that it's not meant to cover every single scenario you could do for green steel or for brown steel making for that matter, but certainly it covers the main process routes, and therefore by concentrating on those main routes gives you interesting insights. So thanks very much for that. And so we'll move straight on to the second part of the presentation, which is more about the results and how we use the model to formulate the graphs that you may have seen in the Green Steel report on the MRIWA website. But before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of land. We're actually broadcasting from the MRIWA office, which is right near the Swan River, and so therefore this land has some significance for the traditional owners. So moving straight along to the first slide of the scenarios and the pathways, and just to go over what Ken was saying, the global iron and steel industry accounts for 3.8 gigatons of emissions yearly, which makes up over 7% of greenhouse emissions by industry, and so that averages for every ton of steel produced, 2.1 tons of CO2 is produced. So it's one of the most intensive industries, apart from alumina processing and cement. It's number 3. And so emissions from steelmaking largely occur, as Ken pointed out, from coke and coal used to make pig iron in a blast furnace, and over 70% of steel is made in blast furnaces and the VOF combination. There is other pathways which also use fossil fuels, and also electric steel making, which also currently uses fossil fuels. But the process route that we used is considered was the blast furnace VOF route. So before I get into the results, just some reasons why we did the study. This graph shows Wood Mackenzie's results, which they've kindly let us use, which shows the outlook given the current market dynamics and the current carbon pricing, which is 0, what may happen to the current ore mix. And the bottom blue line represents the low grade resources, and the hatched line above that represents the at-risk market, which is WA's at-risk loss of market share. And the orange line represents lumps, and then above that is the orange hash line is the possible loss of lump demand, which could be taken up by other products, either higher grade products or products such as pellets. So at-risk demand estimated to have a reduction, if we do nothing, of course, of 313 billion Australian dollars. That's an average decline of 11.2 billion dollars per year. And so in terms of jobs, that's more than 1 out of every 2 jobs currently in the industry. And in terms of royalty income, that will reduce royalties in WA by 37.2 billion, which is an average annual decline of $1.3 million per year. And also the Commonwealth tax payments will be reduced by an estimated 169.5. So really there is no option to not do nothing. There is quite a big iron ore opportunity that will be missed if we didn't actually change the way we mine and sell iron ore. So some more on the inputs and the assumptions for the model. We had to pick some base assumptions, which were the basis for the scenarios that we analysed in the model. I might add that in another version of the model, which we're hoping to put online, you'll actually be able to edit these inputs as shown, and then you'll be able to see the sensitivity. But in our report, we actually did look at sensitivity of some of these inputs, such as the gangue. We changed the sensitivity of gangue, and also we did look at the sensitivity of the hydrogen price as well to see how that affected the scenarios. But most of the other inputs, such as scrap addition, was fixed. We had a linear curve with for the EAF to account for the use of HBI and scrap, and there was a certain fixed limits on the energy use and the ore use in the direct reduction process. So it's a linear model. We didn't account for heat and mass balances other than empirical and linear calculations. So these were the assumptions for the green steel model. So I've tried to summarise the results in one slide. We might dwell on this slide for a little bit. The 5 pathways we covered are shown below, and that's green iron ore mining, green pellets, which were converted to HBI, green HBI, and finally to green steel. And what we looked at was hematite and magnetite options for all of these pathways. And what we found was that we could get an emissions curve for the various development for each of those options. And then I've listed the total emissions for each of those scenarios. So the number you see in red actually is hematite, and the number you see in green is actually magnetite. So for green iron ore mining, the range of emissions is 0.03 for hematite direct shipping ore, and then up to 0.16 tonnes of CO2 for magnetite. Now, this, of course, is just a generic operation. There are other operations with lower yields or higher yields, and or different amounts of processing or different amounts of haul distance, etc., which may be lower or higher than that. But in relative terms, it gives you a view, and it's the first part of the value chain is covered by that 0.03 to 0.16. The next stage is to before you can use iron in iron ore in iron making, you need to agglomerate that iron ore. So we've assumed that the agglomeration pathway that we've evaluated is pelletizing. So when we go to green pellets, we actually reduce the emissions from fossil fuel pelletizing by 0.15 to 0.06 tonne of CO2. The reason why the magnetite number is slightly lower is because the magnetite mineral is actually exothermic, and you get some heat credits when you're pelletizing magnetite. So you get some of the extra processing that you needed to do for magnetite, you get some of that back in the pelletizing step. So the third pathway we looked at was green pellets converted to HBI using fossil fuels. And fossil fuels is HBI is using natural gas. So this actually had quite a high reduction in the CO2 for the steelmaking path, and that was 1.17 to 1.26 tonnes of CO2 could be saved by pelletizing using say hydrogen or green fuels, and then using traditional natural gas using existing technologies to make HBI. So this is over 65% of the reduction in steelmaking emissions by doing this actually known technical pathway. Then to take it the next step further was to make 100% green HBI, and you get further savings, and that's actually 1.85 to 1.9, which is over 90% of the steelmaking emissions is in the iron making phase. But to step from the natural gas option to green HBI using hydrogen, you can see it's a step, but not that. It's a moderate step in emissions reduction, but it's a big step in technical. So the realistic case is somewhere in between probably the green pellets with HBI and fossil fuels to some addition of hydrogen as it becomes available towards that green HBI stage. Then the next step is to actually use pure green HBI to make green steel. And of course, you save 100% of the emissions if you're using renewable energy in an EF. Again, there's probably some transition between those two cases in a realistic case, but it gives you the extreme case. And the extreme case is if you're making green pellets, green HBI, then you're smelting that HBI in electric arc furnace, and then shipping with ammonia. So there are no scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions as far as an iron ore producer is concerned. So this is the utopia, and we're not saying that it's feasible to convert all of the current iron ore production of 850 million tonnes of this process, but certainly new mines could certainly start to look at these pathways in terms of reducing future emissions. So I'll now go on to some of the results in more detail. And as Ken explained, one of the outputs of the model is the levelized cost. And so if we compare the levelized cost of fossil fuel steelmaking right through using to the blast furnace and the BOF, we can see the emissions profile on the left side. And you can see most of the emissions, as Ken explained, is in the iron making step, and most of that is in the fuel required and the feedstocks. And then because you've invested so much carbon into the iron making step in fossil fuels, you actually don't need much to convert. You can use the existing carbon to convert to steel, though in the steel making process you do get that evolution of the carbon that you've used in the iron making process. In the green scenario, we're spending more energy in the agglomeration and the preparation process, but the iron making is shown is actually higher because of the use of hydrogen in terms of levelized cost. And then your steel making cost increased because of the EF cost. It's more expensive than BOF steel making, but even if you used a BOF here, you're still going to have a higher cost from making green steel, and the model estimates that cost to be $287 a tonne higher. So you might ask, well, why would you make steel this way? It is the extreme. We're going to fully green steel, so there is transition pathways, and also the future you mightn't have a choice but to make steel this way. We have to reduce emissions, or there's a carbon price which would offset this. And if there was a carbon price around about $100 per tonne of CO2, obviously it's going to start to make this process comparable. So this is actually for hematite. I do have the magnetite case. Yes, this is the magnetite case, and in the magnetite case, I've skipped the slide. So this is green steel using magnetite. It's slightly less expensive actually to go to the final step, and that's due to the lower steel making costs because magnetite has less gangue, therefore the power requirements for in steelmaking are lower. So it gives you actually a lower cost in the long run using magnetite, using green steel. The next set of results I'm comparing, I've just gone straight to magnetite using the iron case. So the first step is fossil fuel using a blast furnace to make iron. And during this processing, we're assuming that you make iron and then ship the iron. And you can see that the actual going to green HBI is actually significantly a lower cost option than the existing pathway. So it's only the final EAF step which is adding the extra cost in these pathways. So higher cost of green pellets is offset by lower iron making cost in HBI using fossil fuels. So that's a bit hard to digest, and hopefully you can look at those costs in more detail in the green steel report. We've actually listed those costs in table form, I think, in the report as well. But I think the sensitivity analysis is quite interesting. And if you look at green iron ore pricing, looking at the renewable power price that you would need to break even fossil fuel mining versus green mining, you actually get cost of renewable power around that 0.09 cents, which actually is actually currently the current cost, or maybe the current costs are lower than this. So actually, in today's renewable world, if you could generate enough power and you already had existing solar panels, you could actually, on a cost basis, break even to the fossil fuel process. And in magnetite, it is slightly higher because you've got more processing, but it's still in that 9 to 10 cents range for green iron ore mining. So the next slide is the break-even prices for magnetite for all of the pathways as a comparison. So as we just said, the renewable power break-even is around that 10 cents, but we also looked at pathway 2, which is green pellets, and the break-even cost for hydrogen for green pellets was about three Aussie dollars per kilo. If we go down, we can see that the break-even price for pathway 4 is making green iron, and that's around the $4 per kilo. And then going through to green steel, the cost of hydrogen would have to be just over $3 for us to break even on a cost basis for green steel. So the current, I think the hydrogen pilot plants we have at the moment are $7. I think the model assumes $7.50, and but there are predictions that the actual hydrogen cost would come down towards that $4 or perhaps $3 per kilo with emerging technologies and as hydrogen is produced at larger scale. So the other sensitivity we looked at was the gangue, which is the impurity level of the iron ore. And so the model looked at, I guess, from 0 to 30% gangue, and gangue by definition is everything that's not iron. So in our definition includes, to simplify the model, we included mineralized water and silica, alumina, etc. And in that full range, if you just mine the ore at a certain gangue, obviously if you're going to go to a pure iron ore mine and a pure reserve, you actually lower the cost of green steel. And you can see by the solid line, this is the cost with mine gangue. However, you do have the option of beneficiation, and we use the standard beneficiation curve. Obviously, beneficiation will take energy. Beneficiation is upgrading the ore by removing some of those impurities, but that generally takes a certain amount of energy. And the energy curves for beneficiation are shown. So at very high impurity levels, by beneficiating, you can actually bring down the cost quite substantially. But that gets harder and harder as the mine grade gets better. It's harder to remove those impurities, so the cost actually starts to break even, and the dotted line shows the average gang where actually it's not much point going further beneficiation in terms of levelized cost, because you're actually not changing the cost. In fact, if you go below 10% average gang, you're actually increasing the cost of steel by beneficiation. So this dotted line comes in at just under 13% total gang, and that's equivalent to about 63 to 64% Fe, depending on the gang ratios. So if you're trying to beneficiate a low-grade ore to above 63, you're using the current beneficiation technologies, you're actually not adding much value. And so you're better off to start with a higher grade resource. And magnetite does help you do that, because you can have a high grade resource to concentrate that doesn't need further beneficiation. So using a assumed beneficiation curve for WA, and this is assuming EAF with 100% green HBI. This is only true for 100% EAF production. If you actually halved and used scrap in your EAF, you would actually change this curve, because the EAF is actually quite energy intensive and affected greatly by the amount of gang that's in the HBI. So getting towards the conclusions, thanks for bearing with us. So in terms of the model, just to summarise, the levelised cost for green steel, unfortunately, is higher. It's 265 to 287, which is about 40 to 50% higher than the existing steelmaking pathway. But this is fully green steel. And the levelised cost for pellets, and then using HBI fossil fuels, which includes natural gas, actually reduces the levelised cost by $175 per tonne of iron produced. So that's quite a substantial saving in cost. But of course, you've got the capital in building the plant, and the model and report looks at that capital. The emission profile for fully green steel is lower by 100%, of course, and typically 2.1 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of steel. And the emissions profile of using green pellets with HBI and fossil fuels is 65% lower at 0.85, which is quite significant, and is a largely known technology. Break-even power price is around that 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and the break-even hydrogen for green iron is significantly $4 per kilo, which is a reduction from the current pilot plant Aussie cost, but certainly within the realms of what people are predicting. So the model also looks at land requirements and capital requirements, and the big impact of using renewable power and hydrogen is the amount of land that you need, particularly for we're assuming 50% solar panels and 50% wind, and that's quite a large land requirement. And the capital requirements for 100% hydrogen is quite significant, and adds from a normal HBI plant, for example, will cost about $2 billion. The height to go 100% hydrogen, today's cost would be another $4 billion on top of that, typically. So stepping beyond the model a bit, I won't go through the whole green steel report, but it did help us using the model. We were able to get a lot of insights into the iron ore and steel making markets and what's needed for the global steel industry to decarbonise. The reports are online, and actually the model we're hoping will be online soon as well, so you can have a look and use that if you like to. It's an easier way to read the report if you actually can use the model side by side. Steel industry is going to focus on the quality of iron ore feedstock, given that's the I guess the easiest and straightforward way to reduce their emissions. An opportunity exists for WA to supply new iron ore products, which can reduce those downstream emissions. For example, HBI can reduce the emissions in iron making by up to 65%. Green hydrogen and renewable energy are key enabling for the industry to decarbonise. However, the investment requirement in current technology is significant and shouldn't be underestimated. Further research into the use of West Australian iron ores in steelmaking is needed. Some of the assumptions we use are just the current technology. If you could reduce the amount of energy, for example, in beneficiation, or understand better which ores can be used to make DRI in a less intensive way, then this will help also decarbonise the industry. And green iron actually can be used in the existing steelmaking processing route as well as being used in the EAF. And Western Australian government is several, as a result of this report and also their policies and net zero policies, is acting now to support the steel industry's decarbonisation efforts and actively looking at ways it can help industry go down these processing pathways. So I think, how are we going for time? I think it might be a good time to open up for questions. And we might start with the online questions. Do you want to make any comments on the results before we do that, Kim?
No, just to add that we were able to derive a few insights from the modeling. A lot of this, where we say that it's comparable with traditional ways of making iron or steel or mining, it does have the caveat that the technology is available. But a lot of work is being undertaken now to progress those technologies. And also another point to make is that there are often different types of green technologies that can be adopted for specific activity. As an example, for transporting iron ore by rail, it can be battery electric technology, or it can be hydrogen technology as well.
I guess haul trucks, we've assumed hydrogen, but you could also use battery. But the actual energy intensity is pretty much the same. It's the fact that you're going renewable is the main thing. And also, yeah, there's opportunities in the HPI space. Having worked in HPI before, the pellet, we've chosen the pelletizing path because that's known and the standard technology. However, you can use actually fines-based technology with certain ores, and you can actually skip that agglomeration step. We actually left it in there because if you actually use the model, you can actually just take that bar out yourself and you have the same answer. But that effectively going to a fines-based DRI, if you had the right ore and you can solve the technical difficulties with that process, you would be able to see the outcome using the model as well. So how we go? So the first question we have, does the demand take into account the onset of Chinese mines in Africa? It does. It's Wood Mackenzie's analysis does look at the current supply and demand, but it basically assumes that demand will switch to higher grade ores. So the new project in Africa, for example, can do have higher grade ores. So the substitution, if we don't do anything with the Australian ores, could be those higher grade ores. So the next question is yield loss factored into the EAF steelmaking cost? It's the steelmaking cost. We assumed standard cost for steelmaking. The mass balance assumes the standard yield loss. So it accounts for that you need a certain amount of iron to make steel. So it doesn't assume 100% recovery. It just assumes standard losses. And then we use we just keep that constant, and we assume the energy requirements. So the ore requirements stay the same, but the energy requirements to smelt that given ore change with the amount of HPI or green iron that you use. And that's an empirical factor that's taken from literature rather than just a full model of the EAF, which was beyond the scope of our study. But it does account for, it assumes, as does the HPI process, it assumes a constant yield and a constant energy source for a given specification. But as soon as you change that specification, the iron content changed. So therefore you obviously need more ore and you'll need more energy based on our empirical curve that we've put in, which is based on actual actual literature and the actual studies.
Just to add on a point of iron ore being mined in Africa, for example.
Yes.
The key to a key question is also whether it can be done in a green way, and whether they are capable. The point is that I think Western Australia has a comparative advantage in generating renewables, wind and solar. We are one of the highest yielding energy from renewables around the place, and if it can be done in overseas as well, then we'll be able to look at the cost comparisons.
Well, one thing is if there is a carbon price, obviously you can see from the modelling that the shipping cost, the energy cost in shipping, is actually a significant cost. So closer to steelmaking markets, we'll need a greener ore, if you like, from being closer. And if there is a carbon cost, then the benefits we have in renewable energy in WA, and that technology is developing, will be an advantage. And you should be either a market preference or a cost preference for use of Australian iron ore. So those demand curves we saw is if we do nothing, but as the world evolves and there becomes a demand for green, and we produce green ore, then you would see that demand mitigated, if not recovered. So another question. Is the cost associated with the steelmaking step based on electrolysis, direct reduction process, or others? Question. The costs are based on the shaft furnace HBI process, which uses pellets, and the steelmaking costs are based on standard electric arc technology that is current. If I can guarantee you the current feedback from electrolysis, direct electrolysis, is probably about 6 or 7 times the electricity use in an EF. So with the current state of technology, you have a very big bar on the end of your emissions curve, unless you use, of course, renewable energy to use electrolysis. But still, if you're using energy, whether it's green or not, it's not a good thing to use more energy. So as that technology matures, it has to reduce its consumption quite a bit. But it may have the advantage that it can use a wider range of gangue, and therefore the Australian ores may actually have a higher value in that process. So that has to be offset by the current technology and the energy usage that process has.
You mentioned both renewable energy and electrolysis, and those two items, generating green power and the cost of electrolyzers, are basically the main components of the current price of hydrogen. For the price of hydrogen to reduce from $7-8 per kilogram towards the $4 per kilogram level, 2 things needs to happen. Either the price of electrolyzers need to reduce, or the cost of generating wind and solar resources will need to be reduced.
But it is a levelized cost, so the cost of capital, again, discounted capital would also have to reduce.
So I want
one more question. Is there a revenue line in your online model?
No, we were focusing on the costs of producing various products at the value chain, and obviously revenue is a function of cost with a markup depending on demand. So no is the short answer. I also wanted to take this opportunity to ask David for discussion on the topic of whether you think that Western Australia should aspire to go all the way to steel making, or do you think that green pellets and green iron could be a good place to base our industries in the future?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ken. The cost, the model, and the outputs from the model indicate that with the current technologies, probably the best place to go would be to green iron, and the transition towards green iron from the existing fossil fuel technology would be a good way to go, because of the the immediate reduction you get, that 65% reduction in emissions, and then the fact that the cost actually in that pathway is cheaper, given that you have to solve the issue of the initial capital investment. But with the aging blast furnaces in some countries, particularly in Korea and in Japan, the question may be to build a new blast furnace, or do you build a DRI plant in Australia? So they may make that decision. In terms of building steelmaking, it's a couple of things. There's not that much scrap in WA. There's not 850 million tonnes of scrap, so you've got a supply issue there. But if you did make 100% HBI, you could make green steel, but the cost due to the current power in WA and the distance to the markets that you'd have to ship that steel would indicate that with the current technology, it's probably better to start shipping green iron, and then eventually you could see some green steel making in WA. But whether it's not going to be on the scale that you would think that's going to be, the 50 million tonne scale, it might be a longer scale.
Thanks for that.
So I've got a detailed question. In the chart where you analyse the effect of beneficiating the levelised cost, the lower gangue content, feed ores did not benefit from beneficiation. Did you assume the rejects from beneficiation had a zero value or a cost to dispose of them? We just used it counts for the cost in terms of yield, so it's the recovery versus the cost of beneficiation versus obviously the iron content that you get, or the gangue content that you get. In terms of the actual capital that you need and the perhaps dealing with the tailings, we didn't go into that detail. We didn't count the thermal effects or anything like that. It was just a straight mass balance. Did you consider if there might be byproducts from the beneficiation projects? No, we didn't, but that's a good point. Certainly, in the magnetite case, you would have a lot of the beneficiation process do have byproducts which actually still have quite high iron value. So you could have another process which handles them, and you can imagine that. In a mine, you may have to high grade that mine by preferential treatment of the hematite to extract a higher grade to lower those emissions and costs. You would have a byproduct in that case, and that would be quite valuable. It's a lower grade, but certainly that would be useful for blending into other resources and perhaps the current iron ore process stream.
So I just wanted to discuss, we've talked about practically what industry could do in going from green mining potentially towards green feedstock and green iron and maybe even green steel. One of the things we haven't spent a lot of time talking about is the role of research development. And that's potentially something that we can do here in Western Australia. What are the government's sort of thoughts on research into ore quality and their uses in green steelmaking?
Yes, no, thanks for that. Well, certainly the government wants to encourage processing of all minerals and increasing the value of the products that we produce and export and use, and doing that in a green way is also the aim of the government. But in terms of research, they're very keen and they're very supportive of green steel research and other minerals research, and particularly on the green steel side, they have actually supported a project to look at how we can better assess ores for use in direct reduction. And the concept study that's currently being funded by MRIWA is a project to look at if we can have a small pilot iron plant which is capable of being flexible and using low emissions fuels such as hydrogen and using renewable energy. If we can make DRI using Australian ores, our aim is to have a facility which can test the variety of Australian ores and perhaps pelletize those ores to see if we can make direct reduced iron in a way that is sustainable. at the moment, that's looking like it's produced. A report will be put out in October this year, and that report will make further recommendations to government, and government is awaiting the results of that study. Further, it's trying to encourage other projects. There are several pilot plants being proposed for WA, which looking at different processes, maybe newer processes, which could also make DRI. And again, we'd like to help those processes in setting up a way to assess and characterise the iron ores that we have here in WA for use in DRI. Typically, ores have a certain gang ratio that they'd be classified as DRI ores, and then they're sent to the Middle East, and then they're used to make DRI in the current processes. But we're certainly looking at ways we can use the, if you like, higher gang ores and treat them and process them and still make iron. It mightn't be quite the quality of the iron that's made, say, in the Middle East, but we might have some other hybrid process that we didn't consider in our study, such as a smelter or some other intermediate process, which would reduce the effect of the gang and reduce those electric furnace costs. Mm-hmm. So we actually knew about those technologies, but we tried to not try and cover every single technology. It would just be too difficult to model.
Sorry, was there another question?
Okay. What is the assumption of gigajoules of natural gas per tonne of HBI produced? Ooh. How sensitive is the fossil fuel HBI result to the assumed natural gas cost? Very good question. I think you can answer that, or
well, we can. I don't know off the top of my head what those numbers are. We do have a cost of natural gas in there, and we're able to do those kind of tests and what if analysis.
Yes,
we can certainly do that.
But it's a lot of models. They will say, okay, we need a certain metallization in the HBI and a certain attributes that HBI needs, and you work backwards, and this is the gas we need, etc. This model didn't do that. It just assumed that a certain tonne, you have 1.5 tonnes of ore going in of the standard grade, and obviously that changes with the gangue content, and it's just a simple mass balance, and then it assumes there is a set amount of energy, set amount of natural gas to reduce that iron per tonne of iron. So that gas per tonne of iron is fixed. So therefore, if you're going to get you've got to get the HBI that generates. So that's a very simple assumption. We don't use any heat or technical requirements for the HBI. It just assumes it on a mass balance basis. But then, of course, the HBI that you get is a different quality and a different value. So when you go to the steelmaking phase, that will affect the cost of steelmaking. So that's how it's accounted for.
I wanted to take a moment to discuss the use of natural gas a little bit more. We're very fortunate here in WA that off our coast that there's a lot of gas available, and our oil and gas companies are basically extracting those gas and liquefying them and exporting them as LNG to places like Japan. And of course, the other uses of gas is that we've got a domestic gas reservation policy. 15% of all gas produced should be reserved for the domestic market. And if it's the case that we are going to have some downstream iron making facilities here in WA, and in a transitory manner using natural gas, that could present as an off-take opportunity for new gas developments. So that's one point I wanted to make. And then the other point I wanted to make is that one of the pathways is whereby we start producing pellets in Western Australia. But whilst the hydrogen cost is still prohibitively high, we substitute that with natural gas in the shaft furnace. A downside to that is that we effectively onshoring some emissions. There will be a chart in a report that shows that if you were to make green steel using fossil fuels, it emits 2.1 tons per ton of steel. But if you were to use natural gas as a transition fuel, that drops to approximately 0.9 tons per ton of product. But some of that will be considered Scope 1 emissions. So the question to ask is that who makes the decision, and what sort of appetite for that risk do we have in Western Australia, acknowledging that this will just be a temporary or transitory approach?
Yes, so increasing the emissions in WA, but to saving the planet at the same time. So yes, I think that's a question for the government has to look at, and if there's some consideration or exemption for the fact that iron ore processing is going to take more energy, but it is significantly saving Scope 3 emissions, then that should be an incentive for iron ore processing. Otherwise, you have to wait for a carbon tax or something to come in, which may take a while.
That's right. And this follows on from the slide that you had, whereby if we were to attempt to make green steel today, it's going to cost about $300 more per ton than the traditional method. Instead of sitting here and waiting for the hydrogen price to get to an economic level for this sort of processes, the proposal is for that transition pathway.
That's right. Oh. So the next question is, using existing beneficiation technology, up to 30% gangue is optimum. What is your thought on pre-reducing low grade or to magnetite as a beneficiation step? Very interesting. That's a good topic for further research, because if you can do processing that allows our lower grade hematite resources to be applicable for that EAF path, then it starts to make the green iron and your green iron more valuable, and therefore opens up more pathways. So in many cases, the opportunity to make green steel is limited by the ore that you have, and by using existing ore and firstly driving away the water content, and then changing the form of iron, you partly reduce the ore is going to get you that step, and that's not going to give you the get you to what is it, 0.85 tons of CO2, but that step may get you to the 1.1, 1.2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel, which is a significant reduction. And actually, if that technology can be developed, it may be actually not that capital intensive, and you can use renewable energy to run that kind of technology would be perfect. Next question is, have you considered the chemical processes required to produce steel? Changes your approach to consider this. Well, the chemistry is pretty simple if you don't have carbon in a way. So we're assuming 100% green, but in the actual fact, you will always have some carbon in steel. You'll have carbon from the electrodes, and you will have to put some carbon in there to facilitate the reactions. And so therefore, a pure carbonless, just a steel bath, melting scrap and putting HBI, which if it's green, it's probably going to have minimal carbon, is a problem. And then therefore the curve that we use, which has it's like a hockey stick, the power consumption goes very high with 100% HBI. But if you're using natural gas, however, you're putting carbon into the system by the HBI, so that gives you energy. So we haven't actually considered how that affects all the reactions. We're just using an empirical curve to say this is how much energy you're putting into the process, and this is how much extra energy you'll need. But green HBI is assumed to have zero carbon, but transition pathway will have something in between. And so therefore it will help the EAF process for sure. So in a full model, you should do a full heat and mass balance and then consider all the chemical reactions. But in our case, we've just done a mass balance and an empirical curve for the amount of HBI compared to a standard process. So it's using the standard process as the initial benchmark, and then just adding HBI increases your energy from there.
And next question.
What timing do you see for the development of the green steel industry? The Japanese Decarbonization Forum in last week suggested 2030 for the, yeah, okay, good question. Is the steel industry going to be 100% decarbonised by 2030? No.
Not likely.
Will there be new projects which start to decarbonise by 2030? Yes, that's within the time frame. Will there be enough hydrogen to run a DRI plant 100% by 2030? Definitely not. So I think that time frame's 2040, 2050, depending on the technology development. So that's not a near-term technology. I think our report did also look at the ways you can actually decarbonise the existing steelmaking process, and one of them is the pelletizing. So, for example, if pellet plants were to produce, they could certainly be produced in that time frame, 2030, and that would a typical pellet would reduce the existing steel making using sinter by about 20 to 25% reduction in emissions. So certainly this is the Japanese approach, is to look at what feeds could reduce the current process as low as possible, and then of course energy capture, reducing the use of PCI and other carbon and natural gas in the process, also decarbonise the existing process, and then using green iron. If there's a green iron plant by 2030, it's certainly possible that there could be a new plant by then. Then existing steelmaking couldn't use that process. In terms of the full integrated circuit, I think 2030 is a bit ambitious for fully green steel in Australia, but certainly partial green steel or a transition pathway could begin by 2030, and then relying on hydrogen in sufficient quantities to produce iron as 2040, 2050.
So thanks for that. It's certainly green steel may be some way away, but green mining is of course lots of strides has been undertaken in that direction. I just wanted to perhaps conclude with some thoughts. Australia has long had aspirations to make use of our competitive advantages in renewable energy generation. Right? We've been trying to export where we can our renewable energy. We obviously can't export sunshine or wind, so the focus has been on hydrogen. Well, there are a couple of ways we can export hydrogen, one of which is exporting it as liquid hydrogen, but that involves chilling it down to minus 250 degrees or so, and you can imagine the expenses that come with that, and also the safety risk as well with exporting hydrogen. The other alternative is exporting renewable energy as green ammonia. Well, that is economically a little bit more preferred than liquid hydrogen, but it does come with problems of its own as well, especially with toxicity. Right. So recently, I would draw people's attention to the study which is called Net Zero Australia, I believe, and that's a study which is based off the Princeton study for the United States, and there one of the scenarios or pathways whereby Australia could help the world decarbonize is precisely by onshoring downstream iron making in a place like Australia. So if we think about that, just as exporting liquid hydrogen is a way of exporting our renewables, exporting a ton of green pellets or green iron can effectively do the same thing as well, and it will go some way towards decarbonizing the entire steelmaking process.
And probably technically simpler than exporting liquid hydrogen or gas hydrogen or even ammonia. So yes, that's fantastic. Well, thanks. That's very good insight. And if people wanted to get further information on this, they're welcome to go to the MRIWA website, and you can contact our research portfolios through there, and including myself. And once you're online, keep a lookout for the online version of the green steel model. But we've got this distribution list from this conference. We'll try and get that out to people when that's available as well. That'll be it's a free model, so you don't need to pay at this stage. I think it's a free model. That's our ambition, and we're going to do it. It will just give you the ability to do the sensitivity work that many of the questions are talking about, and just to see where that sits from a, this isn't meant to give you a pre-feasibility study or a feasibility study level thing. It gives you a general idea of how a particular scenario looks in terms of all the metrics and all the outputs. So thanks very much. And further, if you go onto the MRIWA website, you may see reference to our net zero conference coming up the 29th and 30th of August, where we're definitely concentrating on case studies where there's real examples of where we've gone down green mining, including the iron ore pathway, but looking at lithium and other critical minerals, and also looking at process. We have a processing stream which looks at, we've got international experts coming in talking about the European steel industry compared to the Australian steel industry and iron potential that we have here, as well as a presentation on the actual pilot plant study that MRIWA's supporting and the WA government supporting. So, and BHP is also presenting on their new smelter proposal and feasibility study completion that they've done, and so that will fit into our topic that we just talked about. So you can buy tickets online on our website, and then it's at the Optus Stadium on the 29th and 30th of August. And I look forward to hearing from any more questions that we didn't get to. So sorry about that. And you can give them to myself. And I don't know if you're available, Ken, for questions on the model. You can contact GHD, which we're proud to cooperate with on this work. And you'll find that there's a summary paper online, and the full paper, which goes through all the pathways we just described in detail, including tables if those graphs were too hard to read. Any final comments?
No, just once again, thank you, David, and MRIWA, and thank you to our audience today. I hope you found that an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. And until next time, thank you.
Yes, thanks very much, everybody, for dialing in, and hope I can talk to you all soon. So thanks very much for your support. Thank you.